So today I thought I'd do some specific tips for individual instruments. So I'm going to start with vocals because I'm a singer, so that's kind of what I'm most familiar with. And vocals can be a tricky one to get right. For starters, vocals are different for everybody. For each individual person, they're different. The style of mic that you use can be different for different people, i.e. the optimal mic that you use can be different for different people. The kind of processing that you're using on vocals depends on the song and the singer. I'll give you some general rules of thumb. EQ-wise, most of the kind of real information in the vocals is between 600 Hz and I'd say about 3 kHz. That's the stuff that people are going to remember in here, because that's kind of what people are basically designed to remember. People are designed to remember people speaking, what they say. It's a evolutionary thing. So when you play them a song, they're far more likely, unless they're a guitarist, to remember the vocal line than they are to remember the guitar line. Likewise, when people sort of play stuff back in their heads, remembering a song in their brains and their memory, mostly the frequencies that they're hearing are not the things that are outside the human vocal range. They're mostly hearing the frequencies, even if you're talking about drums and stuff. In your memory, what gets stored is not really a lot of bass and treble and that sort of thing. So vocals can be very important, or anything that has that frequency range can be very important in a mix. And it's often why it's considered to be kind of the most important thing, the thing that you have front and center, because it's where the hooks are, it's where people are going to remember you the most, right? In terms of compression for vocals, it varies a bit. I would say it's much better to develop a strong mic technique than it is to rely overly on compression. What I mean by that is changing your distance from the mic based on how loud you know you're going to be singing. That has a few disadvantages, because the further away you get from the mic, the more the timbre of your voice changes and the EQ of your voice changes. But I still think that's a better way to do it than over-relying on compression. In terms of compression, it depends on the genre. I tend to like something around 2 times for the ratio. You can go up to 4 times, but if you're getting up to 4 times, I would consider doing actual volume writing first. Obviously, vocals vary a lot and tend to vary a lot more than other instruments in terms of the amount of volume that's coming out on specific notes and phrases and whatnot. So it often ends up being necessary to actually adjust the volume for individual phrases in your song. You can do that with with outboard equipment or a digital meter thing like this one here. No product placement. But in my experience, it almost always ends up easier to just individually edit the volume curves in your track. And I tend to do that for other instruments as well, but nowhere near as much as for vocals, because vocals vary quite a lot. And the more inexperienced the vocalist, the more the volume of the vocals tends to change all over the place. Moving on to bass. For recording and processing bass, it's pretty common to record both a direct in from the bass itself. So usually you have a DI box that splits your signal from the bass, takes one side, goes to the bass amp, one side goes directly into the computer, and then you mic the bass amp as well. Generally speaking, like most people, I find that I use the DI far more than the amp, but it's nice to have both, and very occasionally you can get a sound from a decent amp that really suits a particular song. In terms of processing, I tend to use quite a lot of compression on bass and some quite extreme EQing a lot of the time as well. Like, it's quite surprising how much you end up having to EQ bass in order to get it to fit in the mix. I don't tend to do a lot of limiting, but that's each to their own tastes, etc. Now, guitars, I tend to find small diaphragm condenser mics work really well on amps. But if you get a decent dynamic mic, that can work really well as well, SM58 or whatever. In terms of tracking and placement and all that sort of thing, particularly if it's distorted guitars, I inevitably end up doing hard left, hard right, and then copying those tracks, put them in the center, phase flip them. And that just gives you a bit more space in the middle for other instruments where the guitars aren't. I would tend to do that with acoustic as well, but it does depend on the track and whether doubling up the instrumentation is important. In terms of processing, again, really depends on the song. In some songs you're getting a really sort of acoustic sound which is all high end, it's just sort of the ching ching ching, that sort of sound, and that's sitting on top of everything else in the mix. On other tracks, particularly if you've got a kind of singer-songwriter track, the guitar is far more full-bodied and it's taking up a lot of space in the mix, so there's no real hard and fast rules there. One thing that I do often end up doing is reamping if I'm doing electric guitar, I end up reamping the electric guitar within the computer, so running it into an amp sim, something like that. Often you just get a little bit more of a bite in it and that sort of thing. Drums, in terms of tracking, I'm a big fan of the Recorderman mic setup. If you're not familiar with that, go look it up, it's really good. I have tended to do Recorderman plus an individual mic on each of the different instruments as well, and overheads. That gives you a really nice focused, clear sound without any phasing, and you can do it in almost any kind of room. Obviously the better your room is, the better a drum take you're going to get, but you can do it in a crappy room and do okay. In terms of processing, probably the first thing I do is make sure that the kick is lined up on each of the individual drum mics. So what I mean by that is when you hit the kick, and say you're recording on 6 mics for the drums, and I go in and zoom in real close and make sure that where the kick peaks, that first kick, is aligned exactly throughout those tracks, and also that the phase is the same, and if it's not, then I flip it on that track. And that just means at the end of the day that you get a nice solid kick coming through, which isn't being interfered with from phase by having these different drum tracks out of phase with each other. After that, I might do some individual track compression for the different drum mics, particularly the kick. I don't tend to do a lot of EQing for the individual drum mics, but that's probably because my drum mics are pretty good and my recording setup is pretty good, so I don't have to. But if you're using crappy mics, you probably need to. And then for the actual, overall bus processing of the drums, stereo spread tends to vary a lot, depends on the song. But EQ, I'm almost always going for, peak for the kick, peak for the snare, a little bit of an upwards boost for the very high end, sort of 15k and that sort of area, because that's where drums tend to, particularly the cymbals and stuff, tend to come through quite a bit over top of other instruments, and then a little bit of adjustment from there if needed. Compression, I generally use some reasonably strong bus compression on drums, just to taste, basically, just to make it sound good. Other people tend to do a lot of stuff in terms of, clipping off transients and this sort of thing. I don't tend to do too much of that. Probably the only other thing to go into in terms of individual instruments would be synths. So obviously synths vary a lot, and if you're doing electronic music, a lot of the time your work is half done for you, because out of the box your individual synths have already got a certain amount of EQ on them. They're already done up for whatever particular spectrum they're wanting to fill, whether it's bass or lead or whatever. You tend to not have to do quite so much work with synths. Having said that, often I find with processing synths I end up doing a lot more stereo work. If it's a stereo synth, I'll tend to do a little bit of widening on it. I might do a trick that I noted at another point, which is taking the left and right, plugging both the left and right into an amp sim with slightly different settings, and getting a little bit more stereo separation on the synth in that way. But there's no real hard and fast rules, because there's no real hard and fast synth, and it depends on the style of music that you're doing. So I can't really give you any massive tips there. And in terms of overall tips for different instruments, probably the only thing I'd add is just watch out for reverb, watch out for echo. And I don't mean, necessarily having too much of them or too little of them, or I don't even mean having mismatched reverbs, like having a reverb on one track that doesn't match the reverb on another track, although that is a concern. What I really mean in this regard is that your reverbs and your echoes are also contributing to the frequency spectrum. So depending on what reverb you've got and what kind of EQ it's doing to the sound that's got coming into it, you can get something that's adding to your mix in a way that you might not like, that might end up masking other instruments. So sometimes it can be worth having a reverb on a separate track and just sending to that, and having an EQ after the reverb so that you can tailor that reverb to your song in terms of where it's sitting in the EQ spectrum, right? Similarly, if you do that, you can also add something else to adjust the stereo spread of it and that sort of thing. That's if your reverb doesn't have that kind of functionality built into it, and a lot of them do nowadays. Same principles apply for echo. Just be careful with how those things are influencing your song. As a general rule, you can kind of get too finicky with this stuff, particularly when you're doing your own stuff and it's kind of amateur. As long as it sounds, pretty good and the core of the song is coming through, that's the main thing. Like, I've heard a lot of tracks on Submit Hub that don't really have that great mixing, but just the core of the song and the instrumentation and everything was enough to carry it without having a really strong mix. I mean, it helps that the mix wasn't destroying the song, that it wasn't a really bad mix, but you don't have to get everything super perfect. Maybe once you get into another sort of tier of releasing stuff, then you have to think about super perfect. But as long as the bones of your song, the bones of your music are good, the mixing helps, and hopefully it shouldn't hinder. But, getting to that nth level where you're getting from maybe 80% good to 90% good, for the vast number of people out there, they're not going to notice a difference. So don't worry too much about it.